Hello, welcome class. If you're here for EWS 301 and you're a Cal State student, you are at the right place. This is Chinese ethnic identity, and so this is another lecture that we're going to go. And so welcome. So first I'd like you to take out a sheet of paper, okay? I'd like everyone to take out a sheet of paper, and I'd like you to write, who are you? Okay, so let's take 1 minute, and I'd like you to write 10 things about you. If I were to ask, who are you? I'd like you to write, what are you? So let's take 10 seconds. It could be a word, could be many things. So if I asked, who are you? Let's take 10 seconds to write down. All right, so now that you've written down who are you, we're going to compare that to the what other people think. All right, so before we start, I want to go into Eddie Huang. Eddie Huang is actually, if you've ever watched food TV, I'm a huge food TV watcher, there's actually a show called Fresh Eats, Unique Eats, and he's actually one of, and he also, there's another show called Cheap Eats, and he's actually one of the hosts of the show. So he put out a memoir just recently. In my regular classes, I do current events. So this is my current event. He just recently put out a memoir called Fresh Off the Boat, and it talked about his experience growing up as a Chinese-American man in Florida. So we're going to listen to this clip. It's around 9 minutes. So, and I want you to think while you're listening to it, think about his ethnic identity. What shaped him? What shaped you? So I'll go play it now.
A lot of things in a short period of time. He's been a lawyer, a stand-up comic, and now he's the owner of New York's Bauhaus restaurant and the host of his own food show on Vice TV. It is all chronicled in his new memoir. It's called Fresh Off the Boat. But the most remarkable parts of his life took place before all of that, back when he was growing up with his Taiwanese immigrant parents, navigating the ins and outs of American culture.
I've always wanted to tell this story. When I was 18, on the way off to college with my friend Warren, who's also in the book, I was just like, man, I really got to write about what just happened, because I'm sure there are other people going through this, and we have no one to talk to.
Wong had a complicated relationship with his family, especially his father.
Yeah, my dad is a bad dude, you know, like not in a bad way, but he definitely was a very, very strong male presence in my life, you know, and I thank him for that, because one of the biggest issues with the book and the things I wanted to talk about was, you know, Asian masculinity. It's not something that is portrayed or talked about in the media, many times re-emasculated, and I never related to that, because my father he was a man's man, and he instilled a lot of those old school masculine values in me. Some of them I reject and some of them I accept, but my father is a very, very unique individual, and in his time, a stereotype breaker just like me.
But at the same time, you write him as someone who was really hard to live with. I mean, yeah. There's no way to parse this.
Yes.
There's some abuse that happens in your childhood.
Yes, and you know, the thing that was most difficult for me was growing up in America and seeing how other kids, and you'd see television commercials like, if somebody's hit you, somebody's done something, you say something, and I'd be watching them like in the middle of Dukes of Hazzard, like, am I supposed to call them right now? You know what I mean? So the most difficult part for me is that my parents grew up in this culture. When I went to Chinese school, there were other kids that they were also hit at home. And, you know, I know Puerto Rican and Dominican kids. I knew black kids. I knew Muslim kids that were hit at home. And I knew white kids that were hit at home. You know, the thing is that the culture here in America correctly tells you that's wrong. Mm-hmm. You know, I definitely think it's wrong. I will say this, though, that I've really come to terms with it, and I love my parents, and the abuse is definitely a big thing in the book that is a prime example of how values across the water are different than they are here, but you have to understand your parents in both lenses, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Your escape from a lot of that became hip-hop. What did you find in that world that resonated with you so much?
Well, a lot of it is about struggle. A lot of it is about struggle. And when I was in Florida, they moved me to Florida, which was very traumatic for me, because going from a community with cousins and aunts and uncles and lots of other Chinese people around and more diversity, you know, D.C., Northern Virginia is a better place. But when I went to Orlando, I really got snapped on a lot. My first semester in school in 3rd grade, somebody pushed me to the floor in the lunch line and called me a chink. you know, and I had to decide, like, to stand and fight, or I could spend the rest of my life in Florida just rolling over and being picked on every single day. And I chose to fight. There really wasn't a place for me in Florida. We went to 7 schools in 5 years. And I remember one summer my cousin played The Chronic for me by Dr. Dre, and I just remember the opening sequence. You could hear the jail bars go click-clack, and he said, "Welcome to Death Row." And it struck me because, you know, teachers would say to me, "You're going to end up in jail one day the way you act," you know, and also people would pick on me. But when I heard Dr. Dre, you know, make fun of Eazy-E and all these other people, I really related to it, because that's how I got back, because I couldn't keep fighting, so I would snap on people, and I learned to, like, kind of box people verbally, and that's really what I related to hip-hop, is like the lyrical swordplay, like Wu-Tang, you know?
I mean, at one point you tell this great story about your mom making you bring Chinese food to school for show and tell.
Yeah, that was so sad, yeah.
And it was kind of a sad thing. You
Yeah.
felt humiliated in a way. Did that change how you identified as Chinese?
Yes, when I was younger, my mom thought it would be really cute that I brought seaweed for show and tell, because most people in that time weren't eating sushi yet. People weren't eating seaweed. And I remember I was really excited to show everyone, and they were like, "You eat shark poop, because sharks poop and it lands in the seaweed, so you must be eating shark poop." And no one wanted to hang out with me because I was the kid eating shark poop. And it really made me upset, because I was like, there's nothing I can do. I can't win with you guys, because, like, I just don't know how to be white, you know? I don't know how. And when I say white, I don't mean, you know, just white people. I mean, you know, when I go to China or I go to Taiwan now, people single me out as being American. What I'm talking about whiteness and dominant culture. I just want to make that clear with people.
Yeah, sure. There is this compelling scene I'd love for you to walk us through where you've gotten caught stealing something from your neighbor's front lawn, and the cops show up, and your dad drags you outside to talk with them.
Yeah.
And he asks you to do something. I mean, he's punishing you. Describe what he asks you to do.
Yeah, this was one of the most formative moments of my life. What he had me do was, there was a police in the driveway, and my other friend that had helped me steal the things from my neighbor's lawn was there too with his mother, and the officer told us, you know, "We're not taking you to jail. We're going to let your parents handle it." And my father yelled at me in Chinese. He said, "Huang Yiming, ni guo shi, Huang Yiming, ni gui sha," and it means, you know, kneel down. And he had me kneel down in front of the officer and bow my head numerous times and apologize to the officer. And the officer was totally astounded. The whole
and
neighborhood.
also kind of uncomfortable, right? Which was also an interesting
Yes.
part of what your dad must have known. We're going to do this, we're going to do it the Chinese way, and I don't really care if it makes you feel uncomfortable with our Asianness.
Yes, you know, he also wanted the officer to know, like, our culture doesn't approve of kids doing what Eddie did. He told me clearly, you know, later on, "I don't want anybody thinking that in our culture we teach you that it's okay to go steal things from people. It's not okay." And literally for an hour and a half, he made me stay in the driveway. After the police officer left, the police officer was really, really uncomfortable. He's like, "It looks like you have it under control. It's okay." He almost tried to get me out of it. And my dad's like, "No, he's going to stay here." And it really stuck with me, and I was really proud of my dad for doing that and coming down so hard on me.
Eventually you went to law school, and you got a job at a big firm, and life seems to be kind of chugging along. You get laid off. Tell us what happened then. That's when the Food Network kind of becomes part of your world.
Yeah, I was doing stand-up comedy, and I really loved it. But I met a manager while I was performing at the Laugh Lounge, and he told me, you know, "You always bring chicken wings and fried rice to the events before you go on. Why don't you, like, kind of run with the food thing? Why don't you go get an appearance on a food channel or a food show, or do some food stuff and be funny, do videos?" And I said, okay. So I applied to be on Ultimate Recipe Showdown, made it to the finals, was on the show. I lost, but the thing was, there were people in the crowd yelling, like, "Yo, represent Eddie," you know, like, they were just all cheering for me, and they loved my food. And that's when I said, you know what? I think food is the thing. Food is that thing that Americans expect Chinese people, Asian people to be good at.
But you actually were. I mean, you came from
Yeah.
a family of food. Your dad owned a series of really successful restaurants.
Yeah, it was something I was always around. What I'm really interested is coming to talk about my experience in America. But if they like my pork buns, you know, if they like the things that I'm making, maybe they'll listen to me. And it worked. And, you know, I have to thank my mother for all the things she taught me about cooking. I have to thank my father, and I have to thank all the people that came before me, because I'm just the next in line.
Have your parents read your book?
Yeah. And the most interesting reaction is my father texted me as soon as he read it. He said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Dad, don't be sorry. You don't have to be sorry, Dad." I didn't know if he was referring to, like, the abuse, because I definitely don't want him to be sorry about that. But he said, "I'm sorry that I brought you to this country." And that was a shocker to me.
Wow.
He said, "I'm sorry that I brought you here. I didn't know it was that hard for you." Because I didn't tell my dad to go to school to help me with my issues. I handled it myself. And my dad said, "You should raise your kids in China or Taiwan." And I said, "No, Dad, like, we won. Dad, we won. Like, I'm going to stay here. And I love it. I love New York, And I said, "Dad, like, we're going to change the way that people think about not just Chinese or Taiwanese or Asian people, but anyone who's different in general. Like, that's what the book's about, is if you're different, really, you have to fight for yourself, because no one's going to do it for you." I want people to feel like, like, let's plant our flag in America. Like, this is our home.
Eddie Huang, the book is called Fresh Off the Boat. He joined us from our studios in New York. Eddie, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so we'll go back. All right, so Eddie Huang actually talks about himself, and he gives us a good interview of himself. And now I want you to interview yourself. I'd like to ask you, one, where were you born? Okay. In my previous lectures, I talked about how location, right, is so intricate, so important to your ethnic identity or your identity in general. So please, right now, take out a sheet of paper. You already have one. I want you to write down where you were born. So write that down, or mentally write down. Okay. Number two, I'd like you to write down where were your parents born. So number two, where were your parents born? Number three, I'd like you to answer and write down what language was spoken at your home. What language was spoken at your home? So write that down, and later in our class we'll have a wiki blog, so you'll upload those answers. Number four, what do you identify as? Now, Eddie Huang gives us a great kind of summary of his life, how he was a kid that got picked on, he bounced to different schools, and he, in some senses, right, he had a Chinese background, but when he moved to a non-Chinese area, it became more salient because he was being picked on, right? So what do you identify as? And side asks, what do people identify you as? So that's problematic as well, but I want you to also answer, what do people identify you as? So please answer that right now, write it down. So how do people identify you as in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, citizenship? So those are huge ethnic identity markers, and I want you right now to write down, how do people identify you, right? And again, you don't have to just use these classical race, class, gender, include citizenship and sexuality, but you don't have to include just those, but also other things, such as your skin tone, your skin color. Are you a light-skinned Latina? Are you a light-skinned Asian American? Are you a light-skinned African American? If you look at a lot of the identity theories, right, that makes a huge difference in how people treat you, right? That makes a huge difference in how people interpolate you, right? So one of our theories is interpolation, which is you might have your own theory, right, of yourself, your own self-identity, but it really does matter how people interpolate you, right? So if you think during World War II, you might identify as a regular person, but Hitler identifies you as a Jewish person, and it doesn't matter at that point what you identify as. If he identifies you as a Jewish German person, you're going to be put in the concentration camps, right? So I do want you to answer, how are you interpolated, right? That's very key. So later on in class, I'll have you guys all write a paper on your own ethnic identity. So you're going to research yourself, but I also want you to use a literature review on yourself on how do people interpolate you. All right. The sixth question I want to ask you is, how does your identity change? How does it change? Are you the same, right? Are you the same with your grandmother as you are here? Okay. Now, if you're listening to this lecture, you are the top 1% of the world, right? 1 to 2% of the entire globe is getting a bachelor's degree, right? So once again, 1 to 2% of the world is getting a bachelor's degree. So that right there locates you as an elite person, right? Yes, you might say, but I'm a first generation, okay? Yes, you are maybe a first generation college student, but you are still the 1% globally college student, right? So that, in a sense, puts you at an elite status, okay? So how does your identity change? So I want you to locate right now, write down your notes, write down your notes, write down your notes. What is your class status? So you might say I'm a poor college student on one hand, right? But on the other hand, you are a globally elite person, right? You're the 1% of the world that will ever get a college degree, okay? How does your work define you? Is your work a working class job? Is it manual labor? Is it intellectual? Okay, how does that change your identity? How are you? Are you different when you're at church? Are you different when you're at school? Do you separate your identities? Right? I was raised fully in Catholic school, and so, listening to those doctrines, is it possible to separate? Okay, some people can. Some people, a lot of Christians are bio majors, right? A lot of them are anthropo majors. I'm an anthropologist. There's no disconnect from being an anthropologist and going to Catholic school. So please explore these identity changes. All right. Now one of the things I want to talk about is, does your identity change in life? Okay. So as an anthropologist, I always give this speech, and I always say, well, identity changes in different cultures, right? So you have these Caribbean cultures, you have these island cultures that are very different in identity, right? And I'm talking specifically of gender identity, something you take for granted, okay? So in some countries, right, you are born a male, right? So you're born a male, and you're a male boy, and you grow up into the future, and you become a man, okay? But in your old age, you become a woman, right? So in your old age, you become a woman. And the opposite is true for a woman. You're a girl, and you grow into a woman. And in your old age, you become a man, okay? So that goes against a lot of the gender identity theories that we think about, right? Also, I think some of you probably take, I want to go back a slide, some of you take your sexuality for granted, right? So in my other sexuality classes, I talk about the hedras. Right? Hedras are a group that are neither man nor woman. Right? They're a third space gender. Right? In Thailand, there's 5 genders. So in America, I think we're very bipolar. It's either female or male. If you take a gender and sexuality class, you're going to learn about 6 sexualities. Okay, so I want you to also think about that as well in terms of how does that shape your ethnic identity. All right, so going back here, does your identity change throughout your life? So right now with your sheet of paper, I want you to write down, what did you identify as a child? What did you identify as a child? So if I asked you back there, so we have people helping us behind this. So Mr. Patrick, if I ask Mr. Patrick, Mr. Will, who they're the behind the scenes people, if I ask them, what did you identify as a child, right? I want you guys to write it down, right? So when you're 7 years old, what did you identify as, okay? It has a lot to do with your parents. It has a lot to do where you were born and raised, right? If someone asked me as a child how I was identified as, I would say I identify as African American. I was raised in an all-white neighborhood in Illinois, and actually we were the only ethnic minorities and in Catholic school, and I just thought I was African American. I thought, okay, I'm not Anglo, but I must be African American. And so I came home, I think I was like 6 or 7, and I told my mom, I'm black, right? And my mother like shook me and she said, no, you're not black. You're Chinese, you're Cantonese. And I remember that was a pivotal time, like, really? Okay. That was unusual because, there's on TV, you generally will see, back, especially when I was growing up in the 80s, you only really see white or black, and so that's what I thought. But as a college student, I took ethnic studies classes, as you are taking this ethnic study classes. That also changed my identity, deepened it. I didn't think I ever had really ethnic conflict, right? I think I've always known that ethnicity is fluid, right? So Stuart Hall talks about how your ethnic identity is fluid and changing. So it really depends on the context, right? You're in college, you have a certain ethnic identity, right? You go abroad. Once you travel, right, you're going to very much realize that you are the elite of the global world, right? You're back here, you're a starving college student, right? That's another identity. Also, as an adult, when you have children, How is your identity going to change, right? How are you going to raise your children? Okay, so how does your identity change? And even in old age, like what is your identity? We talked about other cultures where your gender actually changes, right, over time, right? So again, I want you guys to think about that. So if you look at our interesting poster, can ethnicity be a costume, right? Kind of like these racist costumes, right? People could dress up as Asian, okay? All right, so Margaret Trieu, she talks about theoretical perspectives on ethnicity and assimilation, okay? And she talks about terms like race, right? I think last talk we talked about there's no such thing as race, and again, that's another talk we talked about. Ethnicity is, some people argue, is where you're from, your origins, your family. So right now, I would actually ask someone to read it, but there's nobody here, so I guess I'll read it for you. According to Solers, the first appearance of the word ethnicity in print appeared in the W. Lloyd Warner and Paul S. Lunt's The Social Life of Modern Community, published in 1941. Okay, so that's one of the first kind of identified places where ethnicity was used. All right, so take a look. As an undergrad, I recall being cautioned by my professors to avoid using the word, quote, race, right? So in every anthro class, you always like basic anthro 1, you learn race as a social construction, etc. Okay? Unless I knew precisely what I meant by that term. The implication was that I could employ the term, quote, ethnic, even if I didn't know the exact meaning. The reason was obvious. In the imagination of age, genocide was employed against, quote, race, but not against a, quote, ethnic group, okay? But what does ethnicity mean, right? So here I'm going to give you 10 seconds. What does ethnicity mean? Now, in our previous lecture, we talked about how we are all descended from Africa. If you look at evolution, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens sapien, we're all from Africa, okay? So what does ethnicity mean? So right now, take out a sheet of paper and on your continuous paper, write down your definition of ethnicity. Now here, if you look at our slide, there's a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, and he says, "We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools." Pretty famous quote. All right, ethnicity. Recognizing the absence of any single definition, ethnicity can be defined as, quote, a collectivity within a larger society having real or putative common ancestry, memories of a shared past, and a cultural focus on one or more symbols, elements defined as the epitome of their peoplehood. So that's one. And again, there's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of definitions for ethnicity. All right, so let's look at the dominant views of ethnicity and race. All right, assimilation. So here I'd like you to, on your another piece of paper, I'd like you to cut it in half. Okay, so your new paper, I'd like you to cut it in half. And now I'd like you to put down, I used to say 10 for the class, but for you, I'll just do 3. 3 reasons why assimilation is good. So write down 3 reasons why it's good, okay? And I'd like you to write down 3 reasons why assimilation is bad, okay? On the other side, I'd like you to write 3 reasons why cultural pluralism is good, okay? And on the other side, I'd like you to write on the second below that 3 reasons why cultural pluralism is bad. So let's give it that 1 minute. So let's take a 1-minute break, and you can look at the slide, and we will give it 1 minute, and you're going to write down assimilation. Why is it good? Why is it bad? All right, so here I'm going to write down, let me get out of the slide, write down, what are 3 reasons why assimilation is good? All right, so assimilation, generally people think of it as the ethnic American model based on European immigrants in the 1920s, usually Italian or Irish or German. And they talk about it's good because you become part of the U.S., okay? So that's one of the reasons why people say assimilating is good. You become part of the U.S., sort of a, quote, American, okay? Number 2, assimilation is good because, well, you blend in and you kind of like, you sort of can incorporate yourself in jobs. So you blend in and you can go into kind of mainstream jobs. So if you think of the original Irish and Italian business people, they had Italian bakeries, they had Irish pubs, etc. So you want to go into, quote, mainstream jobs. So that, some people argue that's good. Another good thing people argue, if you're fully assimilated, you no longer live in an ethnic enclave. Right? So there's no more Little Italy, there's no more Chinatown, okay? Now some people argue it's bad. Why is it bad? Well, do we have a lot of ethnic Anglos who can speak their original language? No, right? So particularly if you look at language. So a lot of my European Anglo students have a very difficult time writing their ethnic identity paper. And we go over it, we talk about, they say, oh, I'm mixed and I don't know and I don't speak a language, etc. Well, you know, I tell them, go back theoretically, historically, there was actually a lot of anti-German sentiment during World War I. So during World War I, it was not good to be German. Okay, so we had a lot of German immigrants during that time, and during World War II, also not good to be German, right? Or Italian, right? So during that time, a lot of the Italian and German descended immigrants basically forced or did not teach their children their ethnic languages, okay? So you can actually limit, you understand why. And, you know, for now, our globalized world, it's probably good to learn many languages, right? So you can historically trace that, right? So you have a loss of language, right? And you can actually trace, like, what ethnic group lost it and why. And what are the effects, right? What are the effects? My big debate last quarter was, are you truly that ethnic group if you don't speak that language? And it was heated, and it was wonderful, and really good arguments on both sides. Now, so the language argument is also a very good argument. You're losing your language. Also, you're losing your ethnic cultures, okay? So people say it's bad because you lose your culture. And that I mean food, traditions, okay? Okay, so those are all, some people argue, are bad, okay? So in a sense, also, people think it's bad because it's not only do you lose your culture and your food, but you also lose kind of a community togetherness. Okay. Although actually it's very interesting. If you look at even the studies, sociology studies, even third, fourth generation ethnic Anglo-Americans, they still have this ethnic bond, even though it's been diluted, right? So if you look at recent sociological papers, you see that it is actually still symbolically strong, at least, right? Symbolic as in St. Patty's Day, etc. All right, cultural pluralism. Cultural pluralism, okay. Another way of saying cultural pluralism is the melting pot, okay. Melting pot argument, okay. So are we a melting pot or are we a salad, okay? Well, the cultural pluralism is kind of a melting pot argument, okay. And some people argue it's great, okay. All cultures become one, okay. Great, we have one of everything and it's great, we're dynamite, okay. Also, we sort of get stronger with all the cultures, okay? So it's good, okay? And also, I think the implication is no racism, right? Or some sort of discrimination. Now, some people argue that this is quite bad, and it kind of overlaps with the assimilation model. You lose, again, your language, Okay, and also people argue that, you know what, some people have something called a racial uniform. So Ronald Takaki, who is one of the starters of Asian American Studies, so he coined this term, racial uniform. So Ronald Takaki is a fourth generation Japanese American, raised in Hawaii. And he wrote one of the pivotal Asian American books called Strangers from Their Shore. And he talks about how Asians can never, ever be assimilated, right? He talks about how the reason is they have a racial uniform. So although he's fourth generation, he's still constantly asked, where are you from, okay? So another reason why it's bad is, you know, you might identify as a certain way, but people still interpolate you as other, okay? So it's not good, okay, for you to be quote unquote assimilated, because that's actually you will be very ill-equipped to how society will treat you. And I'm actually thinking specifically historical kind of historical examples. If you look at Native Americans, right? Native Americans were quote assimilated, right? But in Riverside, if you look here, I'm located at Pomona, but if I look at the history of Native Americans in Riverside, it has been quite tragic. Okay, so we took out a lot of Native Americans. We put them in boarding schools. Okay, quote, some were adopted. Okay, and very mistreated, very intensely mistreated. And in those experiences, they lost their language, they lost their culture, and then when they were released, let free, you know, they're quite discriminated, but they didn't have that, you know, strong cultural background that they used as a community they used in the past, right? So this is a huge debate, and we'll see if we can do maybe a debate in our class. All right, so I'm gonna actually take a break right now, and this will be the end of this section, and I'll start the next one on assimilation. But I'm going to end with this question: and I'll go back to this. Is assimilation good, or is assimilation bad? Is cultural pluralism good, or is cultural pluralism bad? Okay, great. So we'll take a break, and I'll be right back. Okay, next one.